Hi everyone, welcome back. Now we're going to begin with chapter 7, which focuses on labor market equilibrium. So it's difficult for me ahead of time to determine just how much of an econ background all of you have. So if you find this jumps ahead too far and would like to review, I have included some resources to help you understand some of the basics about supply and demand. And of course, at any time, if you do have problems with this or you're just not quite getting it, my explanations aren't deep enough or they go too quickly, please feel free to reach out to me and I'll walk you through it in more detail so we can understand this. All right, so we're going to begin with what's called partial equilibrium analysis. That's what your textbook calls it. I know it's another name that sounds intense, like it's something, super complex, but really it just means that we're going to be looking at a single market at one time rather than looking at the entire economy. So we're only focusing on the labor market, in this case, a specific occupation in a specific area, typically. This is obviously an abstraction from the real world. So what happens in one market, say for one certain job, will have spillover effects onto other markets, so maybe other jobs. So what happens in the market for, say, dairy products is going to affect the market for bread. There's going to be some spillover from that one into the other. But if we try to deal with everything at the same time, it'll quickly become unwieldy and we're not going to be able to understand the simple cause and effect for changing one variable or changing another. So right now, what we're going to do is look at the effect of changes in supply and demand on the labor market. We'll see how that a change in one of those or both of those will affect the wage and the number of people that are being employed. So how are we going to define a labor market? In this course, a labor market was going to be for a specific profession in a specific area. Every now and then we may expand it. So instead of just saying the market for say, physician assistants, it may be, all of the healthcare market, but it will be tied to one thing and it'll be one area. Typically, it's going to be for the entire United States if we're going to specify, but sometimes later on we talk about specific research and maybe focusing on one narrow area. So for instance, for the minimum wage law, there was a really good paper came out back in the 90s about New Jersey's increase in minimum wage law, comparing the effect there to Eastern Pennsylvania. So they're a much smaller area than the country as a whole. So this graph here is an example of a labor market in equilibrium. So the y-axis or the vertical axis is the wage that firms are going to pay employees. This is going to be the average wage that employees in this profession, this occupation, are making. It can be, in this case, it's labeled as dollars per hour. It could be annual salary, but it will be in dollars. And the x-axis is the horizontal axis. This is the quantity of labor. In this case, just the number of workers. Each point on this graph is going to represent a combination of the wage paid and the number of workers willing to work at that wage. So your text starts with real wages, which is wages that account for inflation, and then it moves to nominal wages. We're just going to look at nominal wages during these lectures because the analysis is exactly the same. It doesn't really change anything except for what the effect of inflation may be over time, which is something that we are also going to touch on briefly because that's, something that's going on in the world right now. So let's start with the law of supply. The law of supply is that supply will always be upward sloping. In the labor market, this means that as firms are willing to pay higher wages, more people are going to be willing to work. People who were formerly unemployed, they were willing to forego work. If you give them a high enough wage, they will start entering the labor force. People have what's called a reservation wage or a minimum wage if they're willing to accept in payment to do a job. So I joked in the last lecture about being unwilling to do an HR job because I would be so bad at it. But if I was offered $1 million a year, how could I turn that down? At a certain point, people will be willing to do a job if you pay them enough money. Because obviously no one's going to be willing to pay me $1 million a year to do that. Now, the demand side of the market, this is the firms. So the law of demand is going to be just the opposite in this case. It's downward sloping. So as the price of labor or wages increases, firms are going to be willing and able to pay for fewer and fewer workers because they're paying more for each of those individual workers. Now, the supply and demand curves for the entire market represent the sum of all potential members of the labor market. So both the supply side and demand side. So for the supply side, we're summing each potential worker in this market. And on the demand side, we're summing each potential firm. A labor market is said to be in equilibrium where the supply and the demand curves cross. So at that point on the graph, that's the equilibrium. So here it's depicted at the point W1, L1. So that's the W1 is the wage, the equilibrium wage, and L1 is the equilibrium number of employees. So at this point, the quantity of labor supplied equals the quantity of labor demanded. So basically, everyone who wants a job at that wage is able to find one. And everyone who wants to hire somebody at that wage is able to find an employee. This is good. In a market economy, this is our goal. Everyone is satisfied with the price, in this case, the wage that they're willing to pay and willing to receive. But remember, from our last lecture, it takes a long time for labor markets to get here. Labor markets are more complex than, the frozen concentrated orange juice market. So if we're at a point other than equilibrium, where we typically are, we're typically moving towards equilibrium. The invisible hand of the market, that's the metaphor that Adam Smith used, it will encourage us to move back towards equilibrium. So on this next slide, we'll look at an example. So let's look at an example where the current wage is below the equilibrium wage. In this case, it's going to be at wage W2 in the figure in the bottom left of the screen. When this is the case, when the wage is below the equilibrium wage, we're going to see the quantity of labor that workers are willing to supply on the market. It's going to be less than in the equilibrium case. So here we can see it's represented on the horizontal axis by L2 with the little S superscript, S for supply. How you determine what the quantity of labor supplied is going to be in this case is you take W2, that wage, trace it across until it hits the supply curve. That is the number of hours, number of employees that are going to be willing and able to work at this wage. And we should expect this to be the case that if you were paying people less, fewer people are going to be able, be willing and able to work in your profession or in your industry. Now, the quantity of labor demanded by firms is going to be higher than in equilibrium. So this is going to be at point L2 with the superscript D for quantity demanded. That's going to be higher than equilibrium. Now that firms are able to pay their employees less, they're willing to hire more employees because their labor cost per employee is lower. So now in this case, we're out of equilibrium. We have firms that want to hire more workers than workers that are willing and able to work. So we have this shortage of workers. So now what's going to happen? Well, firms are going to have a lot of openings. So in order to fill them, they're going to have to somehow attract workers from somewhere else. Eventually, they're going to start increasing wages. Maybe it's because they want to poach workers from other firms. Now, if you're going to leave your job, you normally need a raise if you don't hate your job. If you do hate your job, then you would be willing to go just for better working conditions. They also may offer higher wages to get new employees to enter the labor market. People who were before this previously not willing to work in this industry now may be willing, and we'll see more that are willing and able to go into this industry because they're now being offered higher wages. So this is going to begin to put upward pressure on wages. Here with the second graph, we can see wages starting to increase. So the wage will move from W2, will creep up to W3, the higher point. As more workers enter the labor market, we'll move from L2 with a superscript S to L3 with a superscript S. We're moving along the supply curve up to this higher wage because more are willing and able to enter the market at this new higher wage. At the same time, firms are willing to hire fewer workers than before because of the new higher wages. So instead of having, because there was a shortage of workers, they may have had 10 job openings before. Now at the higher wage, you only have 7 or 8 job openings. But there's still a shortage of workers compared to the openings. So the L3D is still larger than the L3S. There's still a bunch of openings out there. So we're going to continue to have this upward pressure being put on wages where firms have to offer higher and higher wages to induce people to either leave their current jobs or to enter the labor market completely. As they continue to offer these higher and higher wages, that's going to push the average wage up all the way to W1 at this equilibrium point. At this point, we're going to have the same number of workers who are willing and able to work as the same number of workers being demanded by firms. So we will have a worker for each job opening, basically. It's important to remember that we're talking about the average wage here. Different employees are going to be paid differently based on the job type and their skills. The textbook mentions the example of janitors, where a janitor at one company may have a lot more, maybe paid more because they have, a more difficult job. There may be something about their job characteristics that make them, more valuable to the company, or that the company is able to pay them more. But this is the average wage we're focusing on. And likewise, even when you're in equilibrium, there will be some open positions and some people that don't have a job yet. This friction, it's called frictional unemployment. It's always present because people will leave their jobs. The hiring process that firms have may take a while. And page 155 covers this in a little more detail for those of you who are interested in just some of the little bit abstractions away from the real world. I don't want to focus on them too much, but I think it's important to mention them just because sometimes when you're trying to apply the theories we're talking about to the real world, you can say, well, how is this the case? I see that there are these shortcomings to the model. I want to say that these are real things. That you're not just looking at the world wrong or something like that. So now I want to briefly end this lecture by talking about what's going on with the worker shortage, why we don't seem to see this movement towards equilibrium, why we see this worker shortage persisting currently. So remember, labor markets are rarely in equilibrium. The invisible hand pushes us towards equilibrium, but there are conditions that are constantly changing, and it can take a lot of time for the invisible hand to actually, move us towards equilibrium, for the market process to actually do its job. So again, it may just be time that we need to worry about. Another problem is sticky wages. So what economists mean when they say sticky wages is that wages are often slow to adjust to changes. Firms are hesitant, and they may be hesitant. In this case, I think it's likely that they are hesitant to pay new hires too much more because you can't lower wages then later. So when the economy is doing well, firms are doing very well, they'll give employees raises, but if firms are doing poorly, they won't cut their wages. They used to in the past, in like the Industrial Revolution, pay factory workers less, but that's not something we see anymore. It's pretty demoralizing as an employee and gets you pretty frustrated to get your wages dropped. Most people don't have to deal with that. They get frustrated enough. I know I get frustrated enough from having low cost of living adjustments or having to wait a while to get, to get a cost of living raise. So firms are very hesitant to lower wages in the future. So if they think it's just going to be a temporary blip, like some firms have thought throughout the recent bout of inflation, that they'll be hesitant to hire people with these new higher wages. And that's part of the reason why we see for a lot of jobs, especially like fast food jobs, and basically restaurant jobs in general are primarily where I've seen it, where they offer you like a $500 signing bonus or a nice big chunk of change up front. The reason they do that is they know that there's inflation. They know that they need to pay workers more to be able to make them willing and able to join them. But workers, because they think that inflation is going to last very long, it's not going to be permanent, it's just a temporary phenomenon we're going through. Eventually wages are going to go back down. They don't want to lock them in at those higher wages and then have to pay their other employees more, because you don't want some workers doing the same job but some making a lot more than the other, especially when they're new hires. That rightly so frustrates other people. Another thing is non-pecuniary motivations, so things that are not related to the monetary income. So for some nearing retirement, fears about COVID may have encouraged them to retire early, thinking, why risk it? I have enough money in my 401k. I'll just retire now and enjoy my family. There's some younger workers who now may want more flexibility in working conditions, now that so many people have been working from home and people got used to working from home during the pandemic. And firms may not be willing and able to offer those kind of working conditions. And finally, people may have higher reservation wages because of the inflation, because of a lot of changes that have happened in the economy and just to society, how people deal with each other and their own thoughts and beliefs. It's going to take time to figure out just what workers want, what their new wages are, how much you have to pay someone just to get them to be willing to enter and take a job in a certain profession.